Hello, we are here today to talk to Mark Cook about his new book, Rewriting History, The Decipherment of Linear A and a History of Egypto-Cretan Relations in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. In his book, Mark claimed to have deciphered Linear A Bronze Age script that was previously undeciphered. So Mark, welcome.
Hi Jerry, thanks for having me.
So, to start off with, can you tell us what is, or rather what was, Linear A and what was it used for?
Well, Linear A was a Bronze Age script. It was used on Crete and some of the Aegean islands, but mainly Crete, from what the archaeology tells us. Again, from the archaeology, it's believed it was used from the Middle Bronze Age, so around the year 1800 BC, up until the Late Bronze Age in the mid-15th century, and then its use, it's been thought, abruptly stopped. It was succeeded by Linear B, imaginatively titled, both of these, Linear A, Linear B, but it was succeeded by Linear B, an early form of Greek, the first written form of Greek. But, I mean, one of the things that, as we may discuss, one of the things in my book is that actually I don't think Linear A stopped being used quite like that. I think it continued in parallel with Linear B for some time at least. As to what it was used for, from the finds, it's mainly administrative use. So this was used, most of the finds, they're from clay tablets that were wet clay, sort of mobile phone size, broadly. People would incise things in there, they'd record things. So it's counting things, basically, inventories and other similar things. And, you know, they'd incise in the clay, they'd use it, write it down in the permanent record, which would be on parchment or papyrus, and they'd wipe down the clay and then they'd use it again. What happened, though, is that the building that stored these clay tablets caught fire. The building was destroyed and the tablets were fired in the process. I mean, presumably the permanent record was nearby, that was also destroyed. Not that that would have survived necessarily till now. But yeah, the tablets were fired and, like pottery, they've been preserved.
And you believe that you have deciphered it. So in your book, you conclude that Linear A is Egyptian, written in shorthand. So talk us through that.
That's right. I think it's fair to say, though, that will surprise most, if not all, people who are familiar with this. That's quite unexpected.
Indeed, it would be. So tell us how you did it.
Well, I suppose there are two things, really. Firstly, and it sounds obvious, follow the evidence. You know, I tried to approach this without any preconceptions. I didn't really want my views on the subject to be clouded by what other people had written, what they thought. And at the end of the day, it sort of struck me that, yes, some very clever people have looked at this, but they've all failed and they haven't deciphered it. So I should not put much sway in or much stock in what they had to say. I had to really look at this afresh. Secondly, and I suppose you and I know this from the corporate world, you know, there's a problem, the team gets together, there's a brainstorming session, and no idea is too stupid. So when I must admit I had some pretty stupid ideas at the start of this, but when I approached this, I tried not to discount anything to start with, you know. And it goes back to the evidence, follow the evidence, but, you know, cast the net wide. What might this be? And then see really where the evidence took you.
Indeed.
And I suppose, as regards following the evidence, what has survived of Linear A, the majority of what has survived, these clay tablets, this is accounting information. Something was being recorded and values were being recorded against those things. And it sort of struck me as odd that really those that have looked at this previously have been linguists. I think I'm right in saying. Whereas, I don't think an accountant had ever looked at this. And that really struck me as quite odd.
That makes sense. I suppose irrespective of language, one set of accounts in one language is a set of accounts in another, right?
And that was a big help. As I progressed, certain things jumped out at me, but it struck me when I started off at the very start of this project that there were some fundamental questions that couldn't be answered that actually were quite important. So what was the thing on these clay tablets that had survived that was recorded in the greatest numbers? What might that therefore be? Really, really sort of fundamental questions that, maybe because I'm an accountant, I looked at it that way, but it seemed odd. It just seemed odd that this hadn't been tackled that way before. As I say, as I progressed with my analysis, certain things jumped out at me, and that led to where it led to. But that was the start. But for the purposes of this video, and you and I could talk about accounts, and that would be quite boring, I think, for the viewer. I think going back to, and I keep going back to follow the evidence, I think there are really three key pieces of evidence that are really worth discussing now and setting the scene, and that will really help people watching this the most.
Of course. So set the scene for us.
Well, first and foremost, it's been observed, and this is long-standing, that linear A symbols look like hieroglyphs. Now, I want you to put that in the back of your mind as we're discussing the next thing. We'll come back to that in a moment, but that, they look like hieroglyphs. So that's the first thing. Next is a piece of evidence from Egypt. It's called the Golden Bowl of General Duty. General Duty was a general in the army of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BC. The bowl's inscription, as you can see it on the rim here, says that he was governor of the islands in the midst of the sea. These were the Aegean Islands and included Crete. So that's obviously quite an important piece of evidence. And then thirdly, and finally, there's a tomb in Egypt of one of Thutmose III's viziers, so one of his prime ministers, that has paintings and captions recording Cretan princes, chiefs, that have heard of Thutmose III's achievements, and those would be his military conquests. He conquered a large part of Syria and the Levant, coming to Thutmose III and asking to enter into a treaty relationship with him. And we know that ultimately it was his general who became governor of Crete and the Aegean Islands, certain of the Aegean Islands. So I think this was a treaty of accession. Crete and those islands in the Aegean, namely those that had been the Minoan Empire, became part of the Egyptian Empire. And the picture here is of those Cretan chiefs bringing their tribute.
And has this been appreciated before? Why would Crete have done this?
No, it hasn't. And the first historian, Herodotus, he wrote in the 5th century BC, so 1,000 years after the events we're talking about. He refers to the Minoans losing their fleet. It was taking part in an expedition, and on the way back to Crete, it was destroyed in a storm. And I think after this, the Minoans couldn't protect themselves from their neighbours, so they had to seek the protection of Egypt. And the treaty that they asked to enter into, and then they did enter into, with the Egyptian king, Pharaoh Thutmose III, was a treaty of accession. So the Minoan Empire became part of the Egyptian Empire.
But so haven't historians put two and two together then?
I think the problem is to do with the evidence that has survived. What is known of the military campaigns of Thutmose III comes from a record that was inscribed on the walls of the temple of Amun in Karnak in southern Egypt. And they're very detailed, but there's no record of Thutmose III conquering, owning Crete. And I think historians have taken this at face value and really need to consider this again. I mean, I put forward my views in my book. I mean, the obvious thing that jumps out is in the space where the third campaign should be, is a depiction of the flora and fauna of Syria. And you know, this is a king who campaigns every year, and all of a sudden, you know, there's this. This is odd.
Indeed.
Well, what I think happened here, rather than the pharaoh having some sort of gap year, is that Egypt lost Crete later on. I actually think it was Thutmose III's son, Amenhotep II, who lost the island early in his reign. And whereas there was a record here of Crete and its submission to the Egyptian Empire, for the sake of Amenhotep II's and his successors' sensibilities, I mean, you couldn't have on the wall that Crete had asked to become part of the Egyptian Empire and then it had been lost. This was just, the future king could not have that. I think the record was removed and the flora and fauna of Syria replaced it, and you have this rather odd sort of, it is not the third campaign that was there originally, and you have all these military campaigns with this very odd, it's called the Botanical Gardens of Thutmose III. It's just entirely out of place.
Okay, so where does this all get us, and how does that relate to Linear A?
Quite right. Back to Linear A. But let's just take stock of what we've discussed. So we know that for a period of time, Crete was owned by Egypt. And we know that a script in use at this time looked like hieroglyphs. I don't think it too far-fetched to consider that actually this could be a form of Egyptian. And that's why I wanted to run through that before we get into the nitty-gritty of Linear A. I should say that Linear A was used on Crete before this, and that muddies the waters somewhat. The evidence is that it was mainly during the period that Egypt owned Crete that Linear A was used, but it was used before that. I think you would expect that, though. I mean, this is from the pattern of finds, what has survived. And I think you would expect Linear A to have been used more when Egypt owned Crete, because, you know, there's the organs of government, there's the administration, there's more records being created. So I think that's understandable, and you do see a peak in finds in this period when Thutmose III would have been king, about 80% of the clay tablets. But it was used before, and I think what is happening there is that, well, we know Crete wasn't owned by Egypt, so I think it's probably most logical to conclude, based on what we do know, that there were Egyptian expatriate traders on the island, and they used Linear A. Now, why would they use Linear A, and why would it be based on hieroglyphs? Because the day-to-day script in Egypt was hieratic. That was the script of commerce, what things would be written in day-to-day. Hieroglyphs was for inscriptions on temple walls, such as we've discussed, or for ceremonial inscriptions like on scarabs. It was not day-to-day. But I think about where these Egyptians were. They were overseas in a territory that was not Egyptian. And I think for that reason, they chose a script that would have been less well known to the locals if any Cretans had had any dealings with Egyptians, I think it would have been hieratic that the Cretans would have seen. They wouldn't have seen hieroglyphs, and yet the Egyptians were familiar with that. So I think the Egyptians came up with a script that used hieroglyphs specifically so that the local Cretans couldn't see in detail what was going on. It kept them beyond the purview of the Cretans. And then, of course, as we've seen, its use continued after Egypt became, Crete became part of the Egyptian Empire. And I suppose it goes back to that old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, the Egyptians there use this. Overnight they've become colonists rather than expatriate traders. They're just going to carry on doing the same old thing. But they're also going to do some more stuff, i.e. form part of the government, the organs of government, the administration.
Okay, so that sets the scene, but what is next regards Linear A then?
Well, the next thing was to go back to the evidence, and Linear A, we've already said that its characters, they look like hieroglyphs. So let's assume they are hieroglyphs. What is written in Linear A is, it self-evidently doesn't spell words in Egyptian, so something else is going on here. And some of the Linear A characters are rotated versions of the hieroglyphs that they appear to be related to. And this, I think, is really important, because if you look at the later, 1,000 years later, the Greco-Roman form of shorthand that came into use, the letters that words were abbreviated to could be rotated. So I think we have some very good evidence here that we are dealing with a form of shorthand.
And again, has this been appreciated before?
Again, no. I think because the dots hadn't been joined, and in particular hadn't been appreciated that Egypt owned Crete for this period of time, that it just hadn't been conceived that this could be Egyptian. And as regards being shorthand, as I said, shorthand wasn't known for another 1,000 years, so no.
So applying this later method of shorthand allows you to translate the tablets?
Basically, yes, but with the slight nuance that there needs to be some logic in the layout of the text. So, for example, dates at the start, a total labelled as such at the end, where there's items recorded and values recorded against them. Things that are, in some instances, labelled as male, and in other instances not labelled as male, therefore female, you can infer that that's an animal. But it's shorthand, so the analogy I use is a shopping list. Imagine your better half gives you a shopping list and it says A10. Or A could be apples, or it could be short for avocados. And you would know what it stood for because you might have been given the list before and you might have got it wrong and been told off, and and therefore you know that A stands for apples. But someone in 3,500 years, when they see this shopping list written in shorthand, not even knowing it's a shopping list, would struggle. So it's knowing the context is inferring as much of the context as you can from the layout, the logic of the layout is important. There are two examples that I'm going to just give briefly for the viewers now. Both are dates appearing at the start of tablets, just to demonstrate how this shorthand works and how we go from hieroglyphs to Linear A. So first we'll look at tablet HT7A. HT meaning that this was found at Hagia Triada in the south central of the island of Crete. Apologies for my no doubt very incorrect pronunciation. And we have 4th month, and those are the two Egyptian words written in hieroglyphs there. Now, of course, the hieroglyphs have been slightly modified to become linear A symbols. As regards the first word there, horizontal lines elsewhere in the linear A corpus, they're used to count units of 10, and circles are used to count units of 100. So with the linear A symbol used to represent the word fourth, the dashes of hieroglyphs Z4b and Z4b are put inside the circle of hieroglyph W24 to become the linear A symbol. For the symbol representing the word month, the arc of the hieroglyph is horizontally compressed so that it becomes something of an inverted V with curved arms. The point of this, I think, is so that it takes up less room horizontally. Now, this is similar to the rotation of other hieroglyphs that are rotated, again, I think, so that they took up less room horizontally. So we have a common characteristic amongst many of the linear A symbols and how they're derived from their corresponding hieroglyphs. So why would this be? I think this was probably because, like our paper today, the tablets were taller than they were wide, whereas the buildings that hieroglyphs were used on were usually wider than they were tall. Anyway, to give another example, here we see tablet HT1A, the first two symbols representing third month.
So here we see the same process with the ordinal, but the word for month is different, right?
That's right. The Egyptians had a number of ways of writing the same words. Here, the scribe has abbreviated a different form of the same word. And the Greco-Roman method of shorthand was one where a word could be abbreviated to the first, the last, or a distinctive letter from the middle of a word. Here, he has chosen to do the last of these.
Well, that seems quite fiddly. Presumably the word that was abbreviated and the hieroglyph that it was abbreviated to was driven by the experience of the scribe.
I think so. Be that different departments within the institution that's creating these records, or be that different professional backgrounds of the scribe, or different geographical origins of the scribes back in Egypt. Here, though, we can be certain, I think, that these two tablets were written by two different scribes, and I think that's important because once you look at the corpus as a whole, I think you can infer the number of people working within that organisation, within that institution, and I think it was quite big. I mean, as I say in the book, it's an Egyptian temple. So yeah, I think it's quite big. A modern analogy would be from the world of accounting that we know. One accountant might say debtors, and another accountant might say receivables. And as you and I would know, you can infer something of the background of those two accountants as a result, the differing background. And I think we see the same thing affecting linear A here. We obviously know more about our own society than Egyptian society, so what we can extrapolate from that is less, but nonetheless, I think as I say, this is what is evident in the linear A records.
Yeah, indeed we do, but this is quite complex, though.
It was, but this wasn't how I got my first break. There is one tablet that survives that is really vital to all of this, and it's tablet HT123A. This tablet is important because, using some logic and algebra, we can work out the value of the fraction symbols used on the tablet, and noting that one of those symbols has a value of 0, we can see that two categories of the items recorded appear in the ratio of 4:1 and consistently do so. This is really important because in the Linear B tablets, this same ratio appears. It appears when sheep, well, rams and wool, respectively, are recorded. And for every 4 rams that are recorded, and it's rams that are counted because they're a proxy for the wider flock size, which could be many hundreds of ewes to 1 ram. For every 4 rams, then, the flock owner would owe a single unit of wool in tax. I mean, this was a big unit of wool, think like the size of a warehouse, but that was how this tax was calculated. This appears in Linear B, and here it appears in Linear A, because even though the government of the island had changed from, as it now turns out, Egyptian to Greek, the mechanics of the tax being levied did not. And it's also important because from this mathematical relationship that's evident, we can work out the meaning of the symbols representing rams, wool, grand total, New Year's Day, the dates that the tax was assessed, and from this you can show, if more was required after the dates that we just went through, that this was shorthand by reference to the original words as they were written in hieroglyphs.
Yeah, I find that quite fascinating.
Well, for us accountants perhaps, but and hopefully for ancient historians too, we shall see.
Yeah, and I should say to viewers that chapter 2 of your book is available on a link below this video so that viewers can go through all of it in their own time.
That's right, yes, this is in chapter 2 of my book. Most historians aren't forensic accountants, but I don't think they need to be now this analysis has been done, and it's set out there. It's merely a question of following through the logic, following through the algebra. For those that tackle it, I hope, it will be relatively straightforward.
Yeah, and I guess as a forensic accountant, you had during this very long process a lot of aha moments, but just finally maybe share with us something that was really great. Like you had this moment, this is it.
One thing that probably is interesting, though, is that the institutions that created these tablets, Egyptian temples, the evidence is, as is set out in my book, the evidence from the tablets is that they acted very much in this period, during the reign of Thutmose III, as agents of the state. So they were, like in Egypt, they were involved in aspects of the administration of government. So we see that with the tax records that are there, the rams, the wool. This is a record of the taxes that are being paid, and this is why there's an Egyptian temple that is compiling those records. And one final thing, however, and we've got some pictures on this, and this, let's go back to the evidence. I've said it a few times. Always go back to the evidence. And perhaps one of my favourite paintings of all time is called the Flotilla Fresco. And it was found on the island of Santorini, which is, I think, the closest Aegean island to Crete, and was part of the Minoan Empire. And archaeologists, they found this fresco, and it sort of puzzled them as to what this actually was. So let's have a quick look. So as I say, I find this one of the most amazing pictures, and it's really interesting just how accurate it is. But surprisingly, to date, historians just haven't appreciated what this shows. They haven't known the port of origin on the left-hand side. Then there's this flotilla of ships going from left to right, and they haven't identified the port on the right-hand side. But the evidence is here in the painting, and it is pretty clear. The port on the left, the port of origin, is the Egyptian naval base at Peru Nefer, in my best pronunciation. Apologies again. And here you can see a map of the island itself that the port is on, and then the branch of the Nile that's to its left, and then the geographical features that surround it. And, these are all represented in this painting. This was someone who, this is not a view necessarily. This is perhaps drawn from a map, but this is someone who had knowledge of the geography of this port. What perhaps is a view that could have been seen, I think probably was, is the port on the right-hand side, the destination port, which is Katsambas, which is the port of the Minoan capital on Crete, which was Knossos. As with Peri-Nefer and the geographical features surrounding that port, its portrayal clearly pointing to that being the port of origin. The geography here also guides us. And if you look to the left-hand side, there are two buildings. There's, on the horizon, on the hilltop, a Minoan hilltop sanctuary, and then in front of it, as a separate structure halfway up the hill, there's a palace structure. And they're in a direct line together. So this vista, where could it have come from? It's obviously offshore. And I don't think it would have been a boat. I think it would have been an island. And the only place that you could see a hilltop sanctuary, a Minoan hilltop sanctuary, with a Minoan palace in front of it that leads out to sea to an island, is the Mount Euctus hilltop sanctuary, the palace of Knossos in front of it, and off the coast, the island of Dia. And if you'd have been on Dia at this time, looking to the right of that axis of Mount Euctus and Knossos, looking to the right of that, you would have seen the port of Katsambas.
But has nobody noticed this before?
No, because of the flora and fauna in the painting, which are from the Aegean. People have thought both the origin and destination were in the Aegean. But like the early paintings of the colony of New South Wales in Australia, for example, which were made to look like England to appeal to their market audience back in England, I think the same thing is happening here. Also, I think this is propaganda, showing the Aegeans that they and the Egyptians were cut from the same cloth, because the painting shows the journey of Thutmose III, and I think it's he in the central yellow or golden boat, coming to Crete, to the Minoan capital at Knossos, to accept the Minoan Empire's submission to become part of the Egyptian Empire. I mean, if they took selfies in the late Bronze Age, I mean, this is it.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark. This has been really fascinating, and I wish you well with your book. And just a reminder that Chapter 2 of Mark's book is available in the link below, in which Mark uses a detailed accounting analysis to prove that Linear A is indeed Egyptian shorthand written in hieroglyphs, and also some book reviews that have recently been published. Thanks for watching.